great pleasure to welcome Professor Ritu Dewan to the Prajnya Gender Talks series. I have known Ritu longer than you can all imagine. And it's been such a wonderful thing to now be at a point for several years where we can actually call each other colleagues from, just looking at all these people completely awestruck by their passion and their brilliance and all the things that they did, which I have tried to copy most of my life. So having said that, let me introduce her more formally. Professor Ritu Dewan is the Vice President of the Indian Society of Labour Economics, Vice President of the Indian Society of Agricultural Economics, Visiting Professor at the Institute of Human Development, Co-Founder-Co-convenor of the Feminist Policy Collective, Trustee of the India Forum, Director of the Leaflet, President of the Indian Association for Women's Studies from 2014 to 17. She was the first ever woman director of the Department of Economics, University of Mumbai, and the founder member of the first Center for Gender Economics in Asia. Professor Dewan has over 150 publications, including 45 books and monographs, encompassing a wide range of issues, including development economics, gender studies and gender economics, rural and urban development, infrastructure, labor markets, environmental displacement, peace studies, etc. She was a member of the Feminist Economists group for engendering the 12th and 11th five-year plans, as well as of the subgroup on gender and macro policies appointed by the Planning Commission Government of India. She is also consultant to UNDP, UN Women, ILO, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, World Wildlife Fund, ActionAid, etc. She is closely associated with training and capacity building related especially to gender budgeting and gender issues, and has conducted over 300 workshops for the central government and also several state governments, including Jammu and Kashmir, Maharashtra, Goa, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, etc. Her research focus, which interlinks academics, advocacy, and action, is the result of issues related to the marginalized, the last three focusing on the theoretical empirical analysis of paid unpaid work, titled Invisible Work, Invisible Workers, the Sub-Economies of Paid and Unpaid Work, Demonetization from Deprivation to Destitution, and Pandemic, Patriarchy and Precarity, Labor, Livelihood, and Mobility Rights. I am really, really thrilled to have you here, Ritu, and I can't wait to hear you. You're one of the few people I know who makes economics lively and interesting. And in this lies a confession, the number of times I've taken economics and dropped it. So I'm so excited about this. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Swarna, for calling and for organizing these talks. Prajnya has been really a priority for me. I don't think there's ever any time you've asked me and I've said no, because I think the passion which you and Asha bring to the kind of work which you do is really hats off. It's continuous, it's consistent, and total commitment. I think that is something which inspires a lot of us. I'm delighted, of course, to be here, and also delighted to meet a few people who I had met earlier, Kamachi and various other people. And the issue today, I think, which we are talking about, there's a lot to say. I think I have about half an hour, 40 minutes at a maximum. And I'll try and reduce, because this, what has been happening in the past actually it's not only 2-3 years, it's not only before, it was also before the pandemic. So when one talks about issues of policy, etc., it has to be seen in a particular context. So I have a PPT because there's some kind of data which is there, but I will not be talking only on the PPT, of course. I really think reading out a PPT is one of the worst things one can do, because it's a contextualization which is extremely important, but the information also which has to go. So I'm sharing, of course, I'm going to ask, can you hear me and can you see me and can you see the PPT? Something which I've been doing even in physical meetings. It's become such a habit. So I'm just sharing the PPT. Please see if it comes through. There's a eternal, is it there now? Oh God, this. Yeah, can you see it now? Hello?
Not yet.
Now, what do? I don't understand.
Share screen.
Yeah, I did all that.
Is it up? Is it open on your?
Yes, everything. Now?
No.
I can't understand because it's showing.
Do you want to quickly
screen.
email it to?
Yeah, I think I will do that. 1 second. Now?
Yes.
Oh, great.
The threat of email worked.
Yeah, I know. And also when you're talking and every time you have to keep saying next and next and next, it just goes. So, this entire issue of what has happened to the issues, well, not only of women, actually, it's women not seen as again, because if you see only women, it's a marginalization. It's a reinforcement of marginalization which takes place. So I'll be talking in a broader context and, of course, focusing specifically, but not only on the gendered pattern. And also what I'm saying right up front is that, in fact, what has happened in the context, not only of the policy, of the pandemic policy, but even before that, is that there has been a process of gender de-equalization. I don't want to romanticize the past and say that, we had got so much and we were really very equal. But in fact, every single indicator which has been declining over a period of time. So I have divided my presentation into 3 components. That when we understand or when we talk about the pandemic policy, in what context did it come? In what economic and gendered context did it come, particularly in relation to employment? And within that, of course, the primary is the informal sector. Then the 2 next components, one is the issue of livelihoods. And I'm not talking only of work and employment, etc., but going beyond that. And generational impacts. It's not as if it's going to go away with what has been happening. The process of gender de-equalization is going to go away within a matter of a year or 2, but it's something which is going to stay for a very long period of time. And here my focus is on of course, on women, but also I think we have not studied sexual minorities and sex workers very, very much so. They were the worst impacted. No policy for them at all, except maybe 1 or 2 states. I think Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra did some little bit at some point of time, but otherwise there has been absolutely nothing at all. Now, when we locate the policy or contextualize it, when did the pandemic come? Okay, and it came in a situation where all economic indicators were collapsing. We had not going to the debate of recalculating, the basis of GDP, etc. But we do know that the growth rate was declining very, very dramatically, and a large number of industries in the private corporate sector, in particular. And I'm focusing on the private corporate sector primarily because they are the ones who got the greatest amount of relief when they deserved the least during the 2 budgets, 3 budgets which have come, and I'm sure is going to continue in the next 22 to the next budget also. That large number of them working at very low capacity utilization levels. Also MSMEs, which are extremely important and essential to India's economic growth, and not only growth, but development indicators, your imports, your exports, your employment patterns, particularly in relation to gender, etc. They had already gone through that insane process of demonetization several years ago, and a GST which is just not well thought out. I mean, the number of rules that first you had to submit every fortnight. I mean, so how are people to focus on, on developing, whether you call it the competitive advantage or developing, the annual turnover, production, etc. of MSMEs, when you were caught up in this insane GST, which was not single. GST by principle means one tax, but the number and levels, right, ranging from 4% to 28%. That's a whole new topic of debate. And maybe we can take that up next time, because just the commodity specification of GST is very, very anti the marginalized and very anti-people and very anti-women in particular. Income inequality, we know there's been, well, not much debate on this because other things are being talked about, but it's very accepted that income inequality already existed. It increased later on, but it already existed at a very, very high level. And that for the first time in 43 years, in 42 years, the percentage of people below the BPL, actually below the poverty line, actually increased. You know, this was a process which was decreasing, maybe not fast enough. And the poverty line, of course, is extremely pathetic. It is some 27 rupees. How is anyone to survive on 27 rupees even for 3 hours is something very different. But even keeping that in line, there was a proportionate increase. The number of people increasing, of course, is different, but a percentage increase is a huge reversal which took place even before the pandemic. All right. Employment, of course, we know India had one of the lowest in South Asia, but now it has one of the lowest participation rates of men and of women in probably the world. And your rural female work participation rate, very low, urban, extremely low. And the most impacted, that means out of any kind of labor and livelihood structures, were the minorities, or what we call the marginalized and the vulnerable sections, whether it's tribals or OBCs, etc., accompanied by, again, a first-time increase in the gender wage gap between men and women. Very low wages already, which we know, the lowest in South Asia, and this is an average. It's not as if every person gets it. So, which was 4,200, already very low before the pandemic comes, and a very sharp decrease in salary jobs. And this is all before the pandemic. Okay, after the pandemic, we know exactly what happened. There's enough data, not government data, which we know, because, you know, government data has really become like what I call an urban Naxal. I mean, don't release it, lock it up, don't let it out on bail, don't discuss it, don't talk about it. And this also relates to the process which is going now, and that is of what is called the monetization process, all right? Because we know as the public sector declines, employment also declines. Already, the various Reserve Bank reports and various other reports talked about people not being able to afford food items. There are certain specific details which I will be sharing with, and this is particularly after the issue of demonetization which took place. And during the pandemic, what happens? It was stated, you know, officially that 23.24, that's almost 1/4 of the informal, that the GDP declined, but the informal sector was not taken into account where this was concerned. So you had a massive fall in GDP. And I remember that whole debate which go on, that whether it's 4% or 5% or 7%. And the fact that this has been downgraded on a regular level, not only by international agencies, but also by national agencies, which keep quibbling about the international methodologies which are used. There's a lot of data that Provident Fund accounts were closed, a huge fall. Many of them withdrew because there were no earnings, very little, whatever savings they had. And remember that Provident Fund accounts include the middle class, okay, which has also been left out of any kind of a policy rectification which was there. So what you had as a result, and this is again... Hello? Shall I continue? Can't hear you, Swarna. No, can't hear you.
Continue, Ritu.
Oh, okay.
I'll mute
I thought there was a question in between, but please feel free to ask anything in between. Okay, it's not a lecture in that sense of the term. Now, one of the greatest, what we call, well, not only indicators, but the drivers of growth. You know, I'm not even using the term development because the term development has gone out of any kind of economic discourse and political discourse. So the entire focus has been on growth in the past several years and even on now. Whether that growth benefits or does not benefit people at large is a totally, you know, non-debated, non-discussed issue these days. And the greatest driver of growth fell by half during the financial year. When I say FY, it is a financial year in the particularly, and this savings has already been declining. It began declining with GST and with demonetization. And now even the savings which people have been fallen very dramatically. And when I come into certain sections where the savings rate and what has happened and how much has been used, you'll see how horrifying the situation is for the majority of the people. And of course, we know that already, and this was even before the pandemic and very much so after the pandemic, every single global indicator, every single global, I've just listed a few, you know, even health spending. And this was a shock during this budget that even the health spending has actually declined. And of course, inequality, hunger index, India now has the highest proportion of wasted and stunted children. And this is your NFHS 5, which has pointed it out, apart from international data. Of course, the democracy index, because we know that no dissent, no debate, nothing is allowed at all. So from a free democracy, we have been downgraded to partly free internationally. And this is for the last 3 years. And 3 years ago, again, from a democracy, we have been trying to a flawed democracy. You know, so it's not only a question of economics, but the whole political economic dispensation and the structures which exist, which have impacted, and of course, the majority of the people, as we will see, and a massive rise in inequalities. And there's no level in which inequalities have not increased. I mean, social, religion, of course. I mean, we see the huge fallout of what has been happening where religious divides are concerned, and caste. I think that is something we, you know, we thought we, in a way, we got over, not got over, we can never get over caste, but the fact that it is being strengthened and reinforced so strongly is something we really need to take into account. And of all these, of course, are women and sexual minorities, and society which is already, I think, highly patriarchal in many kinds of ways, and at every single level, the kind of impact which has been really, really very deep, and I would say unreversible, okay, and irreversible, unless there's a huge and a massive change in every economic and extra economic structure, including political structures. I think the issues of governance, etc., become extremely important. There is, of course, the issue of what really happened. And here I'll go into some detail on the livelihood component. I'm not taking work. I'm not taking, you know, things like employment, work are very limiting. Labor is also quite limiting, because then you leave out the issue of unpaid work, which is extremely important, and what the work from home and various kinds of cultures have done, and which is actually increasing and being allowed to increase recently, very much so, and the pandemic being used as an excuse. Now, so therefore, I'm using the term livelihoods, because that is really the fund. How do people survive? I think it's survival and survival strategies, which are extremely important. And here we know, I'm not going to the data, the standard arguments which we say, but the worst affected are domestic workers. I'll go into some details on that. Construction workers who were already in a pathetic state in because of the GST, with the collapse of the construction industry, or what I call the dying dynamics of the construction industry, which were there. Demonetization added on to all that. Small scale industries, and I think MSMEs play a very, very important role. I'll go into that in some detail later. Handlooms. You know, it was quite shocking that during the pandemic, the handloom sector, which has provided a huge amount of employment to a large number of men and particularly to women, that the handloom board during the pandemic was abolished. And you know, to add salt to the wound, it was abolished on Handloom Day. So now you don't have a central policy which deals with the issues of handlooms and what a large number of people who are employed with, what happens to them. Agriculture, home-based, own account. I mean, you take it and every component was impacted very, very drastically. There's a lot of international data that women are, you know, their job losses are almost double that of men. It's not as if men didn't lose jobs, all right? But women lost a higher proportion. The number of jobs they lost may be less, because in any case, they are employed at lower levels, particularly in India. But in proportionate terms, 3/4 of men lost jobs and almost 4/5 of women lost their jobs. And there's quite a lot of data. Again, no macro data which is available. So we are dependent on not only micro studies, which many of us do, but also on institutions and think tanks which try and collect. I mean, Azim Premji, CMI, etc., which have been collecting the data. Domestic workers, and this is extremely important because a large number of women, the definition of regular salaried workers includes domestic workers. Okay, now in economics, when we talk about regular salaried workers, we would presume that there's a contract, there's pension, there's provident fund, there's medical insurance, etc., etc. But the definition of regular salaried itself is extremely problematic. The issue of data and data methodology, that's another debate which we can go into at any point of time. But why domestic workers? Because that is the only increasing area. That's from, I think, 2012 periodic labor force surveys which exist. Is that the only area where women are increasing their percentage or increasing their employment in number terms as well as in proportionate terms is in domestic workers. In urban areas and even in rural areas, where now 12% of workers can classify themselves. That is again the PLFS data, which is the NSSO data. 12% of workers in rural areas are domestic workers. When I was talking about savings, 99% used their savings, whatever little they had left after demonetization. When I was working on demonetization and I was interviewing these people, the kinds of things which they sold their gas burners, they sold their pressure cookers, they sold their, whatever wedding sarees, silk sarees, they sold their nose rings or pawned their nose rings. So whatever little they had was already gone, and whatever little was used, almost all of it has gone. And in fact, so much so that a huge percentage, that is 68% of domestic workers, are now indebted. So therefore, it's not only low wages, but it's also the proportion of your wages which are going to be impacted in the future because of the loan repayment. And remember, these are not formal sector. No bank, private bank or public bank or cooperative bank gives what we call consumption loans, right? They give only production in a very limited kind of a formal production loans which they give. So with no succor, no support, no universal basic income, something which we had been arguing about for several years, which has come, the level of indebtedness is something which is not going to impact even now, but even later, what has happened. The monthly wage, which was already the lowest in South Asia, fell even more to 3,000 rupees. And of those who were employed just before that insane and brutal lockdown, and this is the world's most brutal lockdown in the history of the world. Okay, India seems to be a first in many kinds of ways, is that half of men, a little more of women, but also 46% of men did not receive wages for the work which they had already done. And this is something which had started during demonetization. A lot of people did not receive their wages, or they got their wages in old notes, which means, the kind of discount rate on which they had to sell their notes in the informal labor market. And fieldwork has shown, and this is in several states, Bihar, UP, Orissa, also reports have come in, that women in Gujarat, and I don't know how I missed out typing Gujarat, but in Gujarat and in Bihar, women in particular were working for a 10-hour day for 15 rupees. So even your full day was increased by 2 hours from 8 to 10, and sex workers took between 7 to 10 rupees per encounter. Remember, this is what was called social distancing, but actually it's not social. We are already socially distanced. I think let us see that in terms of caste and religion and every indicator. But with physical distancing, the kind of issues what sex workers went through, and of course the starvation level of sexual minorities, I cannot even begin to explain. during that crazy lockdown, I'd set up, I mean, several of us had got together and set up migrant camps here and contacted every single organization. Of course, the NGOs who all stepped in, many individuals, cooperative societies, many people stepped in, but you cannot fill the vacuum left by state careless. It's not carelessness. I think it was very consciously done. Okay, very consciously done, that no succor, nothing was provided for those who were stranded and even those who were stuck in their villages with no hope of migration or earning a little more. I contacted one of the largest so-called NGOs, which looks after many midday meals in several states. And we were working with them. And of course, we were providing this khichdi, you know, which is like endless, which was being given. But anyway, at least it was something. And suddenly they contacted me and they said that in a particular area, Chembur, I mean, Swarna would know that area, is that they had 7 kilos of cooked khichdi, which was going to get spoiled in 4 hours. So please find somebody we can deliver it to. So, of course, hysterically, we worked out. We found this group of people who had not eaten for 2 days. And we sent all the details to this organization. It's named as a religious organization, but it does provide food, etc. And when I rang them up 2 hours later, okay, you know, khana diya, have you given the food? Have they eaten? Are they okay? And they said, madam, where did you send us? We cannot give food to this community. It was a Kinnar community, that is a community of transgenders. And even at this point of time, you know, religion and caste, and those people, I cannot even tell you that 7 kilos was thrown into the waste, but it was not given to the Hijra community, or what we call here the Kinnar community. There is, of course, there was reverse migration, you know, to whatever extent, what we call the long walk home, with hundreds. Even now, there is no data on how many migrants, men and women and children, died on that insane, cruel walk home, which they did to their villages. And you had comments coming like, why can't they stay where they are? First of all, they couldn't afford the rent of where they were staying. And secondly, everyone wanted to be with their families during a period of crisis. And remember, this is Disaster Management Act. And therefore, you know, the need to be with a particular family. And of course, they went back and whatever, you know, allocations they were in relation to Narega, that was the only, that was, you know, something, when I say de-equalization, the right to work is what Narega recognizes, okay? And this is something which many organizations had fought for over a long period of time. And this was the only succor which was given to them when they went back to the villages. Huge competition, people competing that, okay, don't give us the official 190 rupees or 140 rupees, give us even half the rate, but give us some kind of work. And now, of course, we know not even 1/4 of the demand was met. And recently, about 10 days ago, information has come that the number of days, what Narega does, it guarantees 100 days work. It's demand driven. It's the only demand driven scheme which is there in our country, and it guarantees 100 days. We had argued for the budget with the ministers, etc., that please increase this to 200 days, at least for the first year of the pandemic. But in fact, now this data which came out, official data, is that the number of days for which employment was provided during the 2 years of pandemic was 25 days. That is just 1/4 of what is guaranteed under the Constitution of India. There is, of course, many other issues which are there, and particularly for me, MSMEs is extremely important. You know, one of the strongest arguments and one of the best papers which I have ever seen in terms of analysis of MSMEs has come from the Tamil Nadu Dalit Federation and the kind of information which they put out. Now, MSMEs are extremely important. It is not the corporate sector which accounts for the maximum proportion. It is MSMEs. And 45% of manufacturing output, 40% of exports, employing a huge number of workers. And it says that 20% of owners of MSMEs are women. But actually, if you see the data, it's 20% only for the micro enterprises. But as you go higher into small and medium, the proportion of women owners falls. I mean, for for micro, it is 20.4% or something of women-owned enterprises. When you get into the definition of small enterprises, it falls to about 5%. And when you get into medium enterprises, women-led is only 2%. So you did have, later on, after huge demand and outcry, that there was a credit link scheme which was given. And that is not, postponement of paying taxes, no reduction of GST, no saying that you can pay after 2 years, no relief in terms of arrears, etc. Nothing. It was just said that you can take easy credit. Okay. Demand side somehow seems to have fallen out of the policy. And we know the fundamental of economic development or growth as it takes place today, keeping the mainstream paradigm of growth in mind, is that demand determines, the typical demand supply market issues. And unless demand is there, no one can perform. And demand, of course, impacted because people didn't have the money to buy anything except basic food, and also a disruption of the valued supply chain. I think that is something which is extremely important. The raw material issue, and also the external demand decline. And please remember that a large number of MSMEs as corporate sectors also depend on imports, all right? And during this period of time, you have the China incursion, on which no military response was taken. The only response which was taken was ban China products, okay? And you had this ban on import of cheap China products, which really are the mainstay of industry. Good or wrong, I'm not getting into that issue at all, but the fact that is the economic reality which exists. And with that stop, that was another shock to production of MSMEs, and a large number of them have fallen by the way. The credit-linked scheme, which was announced in the last budget, more than 85%, and this is also data which came just 3 days ago, 85% did not and could not access it. Okay, in terms of regulations, in terms of rules, in terms of, and please remember MSMEs, there is this touting that the number of MSMEs has increased by 75% registration in the last year. But please remember now MSMEs definition has changed. Also, agricultural SHGs, self-help groups are allowed to register as MSMEs, and also these startups, what we talk about, increasingly able to access the cheap credit availability which is there, they are now registered as MSMEs. So, data, there are hidden stories behind the data, and we really need to go into that. And that's why this entire issue of macro and micro become extremely important to be able to understand what the economic reality of the majority of the people in our country is. Poverty rate increase for men and for women, it was already a percentage. And I'm talking about the desperation levels of poverty rates. And this is something, like I said earlier, which had actually been falling. And this is just in 1 year, 2019 to 2020, which increased. Women in extreme poverty, that is not even getting, I think that I don't even know what the definition is. If poverty level is 27 rupees, I think extreme poverty is not even half. So that's 12 to 14 rupees a day. And the number of women in extreme poverty fell. Now, how many were migrants? There is no data. How many men? No data at all. And also, I find this the cruelest, what we call the frontline warriors. I don't know why we use the term warriors. It's such a military patriarchal term. It should be the frontline saviors during the pandemic. That is the nurses and the medical workers. The majority are women, which we already know. Nurses, also doctors, 85%. And 72% of those who died were women, of the health workers. Okay. And you see the policies which are coming now. Nurses are not getting their salaries. Anganwadi workers, the increase is not being implemented, and the increase is of some 100 or 120 rupees a month. You remember Anganwadi workers, they and Asha work, they started with 27 schemes. Okay, that is all when they were first appointed on honorariums, and now they have to implement and cover more than 70 schemes. All right, so they were not paid. Nurses are not being appointed on regular salary basis with pension and provident fund, etc. They're being appointed on a contractual level. In Maharashtra, in fact, there was a 6-day strike against privatization of nurses, that is nurses on contract being given to a private agency and not being appointed directly as nurses. SHGs, of course, we know there's this thing of Jan Dhan accounts and financial inclusion has increased, but most of these are zero balance accounts. People don't have money to put into the accounts. In fact, if you ask somebody who go into the field and ask, "Ke aapke account mein kitna paisa hai?" and they just turn away, they in disgust. They don't even want to reply to such an insensitive question. And of course, like I said, what happened to migrant women and sex workers is something which I think I really don't know what words to. It's not destitution. I don't know what really word to use to what happened to them. They didn't have ration cards, nothing, absolutely nothing at all. No one gave them shelter, no one gave, very few gave them food. It was only the NGOs at some level, the evolved, so we call evolved NGOs, which managed to provide something at least for them. Now, gender specific, okay, that is overall gendered men and women. This is impacts which are on women specifically. And all of these are generational impacts. It's not only this generation, but several generations. And when I say generation, I'm not talking of children. I'm talking of the children perceived as the future workforce. And therefore, your economic fundamental of that is extremely important. Already we know that almost 40% of girls drop out in the secondary level. They don't own mobiles. I think this is all official data. Only 11% own a mobile. How many of them are allowed to use? And then you, of course, you have your Khap Panchayats and various other caste and religion rules, which do not allow women to use mobiles. So what happens to your education, which is already there? And remember, it was April 2020, when the pandemic struck, that the first thing which was done was to stop scholarships for scheduled caste people, boys and girls. This was absolutely, it was, I really, like I said, I'm at loss for words that how at this point of time, when we know the huge inequality where caste is concerned, that even the scholarships were stopped because schools were not, there was online and you still had to pay your fees, etc., and buy the books. And in fact, with an added expenditure, and that is online expenditure or digital expenditure, what we talk about. NFHS data again, and also related primarily to the period of the pandemic, okay? That food, cereal consumption, that is your basic rice and wheat, fell by half. Dals fell even more. Stunting and wasting had already increased, like I said, particularly in children below 5 years of age. Except for 2 or 3 states, midday meals were totally stopped. What happened to this money? Is it put back? That's another issue of financial transparency, which is not available for us to access at all. It was only, like I said, in 2 or 3 states that some kind of ICDS forms in terms of dry rations, etc., existed. But more than half the children did not even get the dry ration to be cooked at home. And with ICDS stopped, immunization, which is so basic and so fundamental in this hysteria of, the COVID injections which had to be given. And I remember, some of us will remember that when the polio eradication drive had taken place in the 90s, it was done house to house with no shusha, with no drama, with no media announcements, nothing at all. But now when it happened in terms of taking your Covaxin or Covishield or whatever it was, the issue of human immunization just got absolutely covered. It just became a non-issue for all the, many of the state governments. And you have, and this is recorded, an increase in infant mortality rate, an increase in child mortality rate. And for women, of course, with the entire focus on COVID and COVID management, the natal services issue became extremely, and many studies have pointed out a rise in maternal mortality rate, in death, in morbidity, and unsafe abortions. This is something which is extremely important. And I managed to get the figure only 2 days ago. 60 million unsafe abortions in 2019-20. Okay, just 1 year. And what it does to women, and I cannot even get into any kind of, we can all visualize what really is happening. Also, unplanned pregnancies, 26 million. Okay, that's a huge amount. Again, just in 1 year ago. One of what I call the collateral results. And this is, we have worked a lot. I mean, Asha's here. She's done a lot on disaster management. And one of the first things, and there are many international studies and many national studies which are there, that one of the first fallouts of any form of displacement, particularly under disaster management, is the impact on children in terms of a rise in child marriages. Okay, just today, I think it has been reported that there are 511 child marriages in Chennai during this period. But I think that's really an understatement. And in Maharashtra, it's already been recorded that there are some 30 or 40,000 child marriages which increase. Because it's not only the question of children. Please remember, it's a question of the transfer of labor of one person into another house. Okay, and this becomes extremely important in terms of when there are declining incomes and absolute asset and other kinds of wealth inequalities which exist. Gender-based violence. There's a new term which had come. Okay, I couldn't understand this term when it came. Shadow pandemic. Okay, a massive rise in domestic violence which took place, and even during this period, the Nirbhaya funds were not spent. And this is, I've just given one state data because that's the worst. Even at the national level, why was 3/4 of the Nirbhaya fund, which itself is very little in any case, was transferred to the Ministry of Home Affairs from the Ministry of Women and Child? No explanation for this. We wrote letters asking what is the reason, for what has this been done, but absolutely nothing. And a large number of studies which we have done that on an average, the increase in violence against women, it was 171% in India. And this is something which is ongoing, because it's not only the issue of violence or gender-based violence, it's the issue of violence. And what is happening in our society under, the political dispensations which exist. There is a actualization of violence. There's a normalization of violence. So now when somebody is lynched for whatever, there is no criticism. It comes as, a tiny column somewhere, if it gets covered at all in the media. And there is an internalization of violence. I think that is something which we really need to understand and to work on. Of course, there is the justice system. We know what happened and what happens in terms of, I'm not saying the judiciary overall, but one of the things was release of convicted people. And one of the first to be released in UP was the convicted rapist. You remember the Hathras case, and you remember several other cases. The aunt and the father were killed as when they were witnesses. That person was let out on release. In Punjab, again, you had the biggest rapist let out on release just before the Punjab elections. So please try and understand, the entire overall overarching connections which exist. And a large number of people who are what we call political prisoners or prisoners of lack of freedom of speech have not been released. Or we know the numbers and we know the details of that. And what I think is one of the most important, which is not being talked about, I'm not saying less important, more important than the others, but this is what I call the macroeconomic component, and that is your unpaid work. As we know that a paid economy cannot exist unless there is an unpaid economy. And this unpaid economy is, of course, of women. I mean, hugely and massively of women, but also single male migrants. I think that is something one area where we really have to work on and try and understand. And within this, the work from home attitude, which is there and which was a compulsion, all that is taken into account in terms of whether it's violence or the huge increase in the number of hours that a woman had to work within the house. But there were macroeconomic policy decisions taken at the same time. And in 2020, you had what is called DBTK, that is your direct benefit transfer to kerosene, that retailers were allowed to increase the price of kerosene by 25 paisa every fortnight. Now, we know paisa doesn't sound something, but if you see it over a period of weeks, it increases by 2, 3, 4, 5 rupees per liter. And that means that the sourcing of cooking fuel, which is seen as a woman's job, has been impacted, and her hours of work on collecting cooking fuel has increased. And the Ujjwala scheme, to whatever extent it was implemented, with all its flaws, that at least benefited some people, that scheme was stopped. The price of a cylinder means that even the lower middle class cannot now afford, and therefore your unpaid work burden actually increased. And this is recorded data again on the websites. And this is, I'm talking of only of last year, 3% in it. That's before the price of a cylinder went up from 600 rupees to over 1,000 rupees in most of the metro components. In the end, I don't know what to say as a conclusion, but it's always in view of a conclusion, because how do you conclude pain? And how do you conclude? It's not an uncaring policy. I think it's a very consciously thought out policy that labor does not matter, capital matters. You know, I think that's the fundamental takeaway which we have. And it is during this period of time that you have ordinance of farm acts. Okay, let's not call them farm acts. They have ordinances which came. And this is the only sector, remember, agriculture, is which showed an increase in growth rate of 3% even during the pandemic. And you had these farm acts, which we know have led to the longest and most historical agitation in the history of the world again. You know, so there are many firsts we are ashamed of, but there are many firsts that we are also very proud of. Okay. Your labor codes, which came in during this period of time, no debate, no discussion. The definition of work, worker, workplace totally taken away. Your social security taken away. Sexual harassment, dealing from safety conditions of work. Your rights of unionization taken away. Okay, even, and this, please remember the struggle of Anganwadi workers and many, many other workers, which is going on right now against what is called this whole sale of public assets, or what is called, you know, this Atmanirbhar is not a, it's a Hindi version of an old, what we used to call self-reliance. All right. Now you see this issue of self-reliance, and you see this issue of foreign direct investment. Of course, a lot is going away, but remember the LIC fiasco of just last week, okay, opening up the monetization pipeline, that is selling of public assets at hugely discounted rates, massively discounted rates at every level. The reduction in corporate taxes for the corporate bonanza, which came in 2019 and has been extended by another 4 years to 2025. That is, instead of 30% tax, they now pay only 15% tax. Okay, and it has not been reduced for pensioners or for middle class. It's totally caught into everything. There is another constitutional issue which is very important and which has a long-term effect, and that is that the GST share of the states is not being given. Okay. In Maharashtra, it is 56,000 crores. In Bengal, it's another, I don't know how many thousand crores. And please remember, these are also states which do not adhere to the center line in every single place. And this is a constitutional issue, because your GST Act says that this is that constitutional share has to be linked. So your 15th Finance Commission becomes extremely important to be able to analyze. And what it does is that the state money which is being spent on COVID, because of lack of support from the national level, that a large part of their funding is being taken out of the social sector. That means your development indicators are going to fall even more. there are many. I think if you see the budget and there's not a single sector where the money has not been reduced, whether it's Narega or creches or nutrition. On ICDS, with the stunting data, your allocation has been reduced so dramatically. On widows and female-headed households means only widows, okay, deserted, etc., are not to be taken. Anyone out of the patriarchal slot is not really taken into account. Even for the blind, it has gone down at every single level, and of course, disability issues. Again, we have Asha, who's an expert on this, and I'm sure she'd be aware of the kind of reduction in this. So, to come back to what I talked about, that the state we see the state as an equalizer and an enabler. That the state, a welfare state in particular, and a state which is sensitive to the needs of its citizens, apart from asking the citizens to prove their citizenship, is that it should reduce inequalities and enable them to come out of poverty and various other kinds of social, economic, caste and religious kinds of divides. But in fact, it's not only a non-enabler, but it has become an anti-enabler and an anti-equalizer. And I think that is the change in the nature of the state is something which we have to really get into in much, much more detail in its many avatars. Because remember, the construct of the state is, of course, at a national level, it's a macro. We are talking of a state. We're not talking of a state in capital S, not talking of state governments, deeply rooted and increasingly rooted in patriarchal structures and rigidities. So I'll stop here. I have a lot more to say, but I think, I don't know how much over time I've gone. I'm sorry.
No, we never watch the clock for the PGTs, because the reason we now want people to come and speak here is we don't have to limit them to 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. We can actually listen to what a person has to say in full. But I want to thank you, Ritu, because there's a poem we learned in school, the SSC board. We learned an extract from The Deserted Village, which of course was written after a particular economic moment. And there's an extract that we read called The Village Schoolmaster, which has this line about children responding to the village schoolmaster. It's still they gazed, and still the wonder grew, that one small head could carry all he knew. And I was listening to you today thinking, what is the order of scholarship and erudition that it takes to speak so simply and accessibly about a subject that is not normally accessible to people? So I'm just really grateful that you came, and that people like me who struggle to stay tuned could actually put this picture together in their heads for whatever it is that we do. So thank you so much. We already have questions in the chat box. I'll start with Karthik Station's comment. This is the first session on economics that I have ever attended, and it was very enlightening. We have a question from Meghna. Thank you for the wonderful session, Professor Dewan. My question to you is, how can policies for gig workers, especially women, be formulated better to address the issues of gender inequality in the labor market and the gig economy? And then Kamachi has a question, and I'll read it out so you can take them both sequentially. It was an excellent presentation, Ritu ma'am. I request you to throw light on decentralized gender budgeting and women's livelihood, especially in the unorganized sector. So back to you, Ritu, and thank you again.
Huge questions, and I think each one deserves another 1 hour of talk, which of course I will not do. I will not subject you to that. But please remember this entire issue of gig workers, okay, is who do you include, who do you not include within that? The definitions are coming out. It's not only your Zomato and your Swiggy, etc., etc. Can you also take those who are employed increasingly in this work from home call center? Are they gig workers? Are work from home women in terms of, we were doing this discussion for Indian Express. It's going to come out soon in terms of what really is happening in this work from home. And increasingly, I find that in fact, the corporate sector in particular is encouraging work from home for women, but not for men. Okay. And this is because if it is women who are doing work from home, they cannot apply for a simple thing like maternity leave, that you're already at home, so why do you need maternity leave? And so therefore, this entire strength of the unpaid economy component is actually increasing much more than the paid economy aspect. Now, this gig workers is, of course, there is talk about social security for them, but let us remember that what the labor codes on social security says. One is that even a thing like the bonus, which used to be calculated on a methodology which was laid down in the law, okay, that methodology and mathematical calculation has been removed. And it is being replaced by a phrase which says that social security schemes may be introduced, okay, not will be, not shall be, may be introduced as and when necessary. Okay, so please keep that as the center component, even under this talk about the gig workers. Also, at some level, this problem of definition of gig workers, I have a problem with the fundamental definition itself. And the conditions of work. How do you regulate or provide a scheme for gig workers who are supposed to deliver in 10 minutes? I mean, there are several studies, and particularly by unions, have come out against. Of course, gig workers are not allowed unions, but there are many representatives. We've taken up this kind of an issue in court, etc., etc. Is the issue of reaching a product within 10 minutes? Okay, the kind of it's not only the tension of serving a product within 10 minutes. It's the fact that if you don't do it within 10 minutes, of course, you are tracked. Don't forget that every minute of yours is tracked. Okay, so that's another emerging area of employment which exists. And that tracking, if it is your fault, even if it is traffic and even if it is something else, that money which is there for not delivering in 10 minutes, the fine which is there is cut from the salary. Okay, so how is your social security going to protect that salary cut which is there? You remember the beedi workers movement of the 70s and of the 80s, which fought against the contractors, the beedi contractors, who kept throwing away at least 20 to 25% of the beedis manufactured under what is called bad product. Okay, that the thread is not proper, the tobacco is not enough, etc., etc. And so appropriated labor worth 20% of the total product, which is exactly what is being done now. So we have to see it in terms of exchange value, but also in terms of use value. So these schemes which are there, I think, are extremely, they don't take all the definition of gig workers into account, because I think that word gig is too small to encompass the kinds of sectors and subsectors which come under this. And of course, the scheme which is there, I think we need to evaluate it. But just yesterday, I was in another meeting with V.V. Giri Institute, that is a National Labour Institute of India, and where the person who had drafted from the Labour Institute, who had drafted the Social Security Code, was explaining how difficult it was to expand the definition. Not difficult, it was impossible. There was just no debate on expanding the definition of gig and on specifying the social sector schemes, because the term is may be and not shall be and will be done. So I think that is one aspect we need to take into account. And of course, the constraints on any kind of agitation, which is your Labour Code 4, which earlier said that you cannot go on strike, and that was only for public utility services, what is called ESMA, Essential Services Maintenance Act. But now that has been removed and it is applied to every single, including nurses, including teachers. Even for a one-day casual leave, you have to give 60 days notice. All right. Another issue of gig workers, which is again only in the last month, I think, which has emerged, apart from this 10-minute delivery issue, is that because of the cost of fuel, and you remember most of this cost of fuel which comes is because of the central taxes, the non-payment of GST to the state, because the state has only two sources of increasing its revenue. One is fuel and the other is alcohol. Okay. And these are the only two under VAT. So why are they not under GST, but the central pool, or what we call the central share? Of course, there was a reduction of 4 rupees or 5 rupees in the petrol and the diesel price just, I think, about 2 weeks ago. But please remember, this share is in the tax due only to the center. It's nothing to do with the states. It does not benefit the states at all. Now, within this, a large number of delivery companies, okay, said that they cannot spend on fuel anymore. So these young boys of 17, 18, 20, whatever they are now being asked to use mopeds and electric mopeds, which are hugely slow, which are like cycles, and also today's statement, if you see in the paper, which have no kind of safety standards. Okay, so you have exploding e-bikes which exist. Now, to match the 10 minutes within a sort of a mini cycle and not even a scooter, or forget about a motorcycle, is going to harm them even more. And I'm not only talking in terms of loss of insurance, etc., which they don't get in any kind of a place. You go to any insurance company. In fact, that's my new work, which I'm doing right now, is on insurance and how anti-people it is, apart from the issue of privatization. And within that, they are not allowed insurance because their work is considered very dangerous. So they don't get life insurance, they don't get medical or accident kind of insurance, even from personal premiums, which they might have to pay. And at the same point, what we call the stylized fact, the existing fact, macroeconomic fact of that, the structural conditions on their delivery time. I think that is also one aspect which we have to see. The second is decentralized gender budgeting. Now, I think the gender budgeting is, it's become a sort of a rather, I'm not against gender, but we fought for it, in the 10th plan, and we got it in the 11th and the 12th plan, the women's component plan. And we know all that. We do gender budgeting exercises, whether it's through CBG or individually, etc., etc. But remember, it's become only a sort of a chartered account exercise. Okay, kitna mila, kitna kharcha. That means how much did you get and how much did you spend, utilization level. So your utilization level of what we call the AE, that is your actual expenditure, is really declining. And I was really quite shocked when I did this for several sectors in the pandemic budget. And I found that there was unspent in the Ministry of Labor. 60% of the allocation was unspent under the Ministry of Labor and Employment, when in fact it should have shot over and gone way beyond whatever was allocated. The overall, I think this Beti Padhao, Beti Bachao kind of a thing, not to be taken seriously, because 56% of whatever pathetic allocation it is spent on advertising. Okay. And only 19% has been distributed in the entire country. 19, not even 20% has been distributed. And if you see the gender budget of the last, 2 years, year before last, the Ministry of Women and Child got, and I'm saying this is a percentage of GDP, okay? It's not the money amount, it's the share of the country's resources, revenue resources. How much do you get? 0.71. Okay, that was in the last budget. And this current budget, even that has come down to 0.66. So it's not even 1%. So how seriously are we to take whatever little allocations have been done? If you see a working women's scheme, etc., all that has gone for a toss. The working women's hostels which exist, the various kinds of centers, the various kinds of creches, etc. And I just like to share what I calculated in the last to last budget. Okay, the one which was there when the pandemic came. That the budget allocation for women's hostels in the entire country, 410 crores, okay? Plus the Mahila Shakti Kendras, you add that, so 410 crores for 4 major schemes. Working women's hostels plus Mahila Shakti Kendras plus national crest scheme, plus rescued trafficked women, okay, of which India has the highest proportion in Asia, plus widows. The allocation was 410 crores. Okay. For the Rashtra Gokul mission, okay, that's your cow mission, it was 750 crores. All right. Which meant that your cows got 187 crores per month. Okay. And women under these 4 schemes, very, very important schemes, widows and, trafficked women, etc., 34 crores a month. So I think this really shows the priority. So it's okay to say, utilize it. Of course, we have to fight for more. But it's not only the allocation, we also have to see the revenue raising. Okay. Now, that's why, a lot of work and this is what I call feminist finance. I've been writing about this for some point of time. It's not in the allocations. Where does the money come from? You just take the GST and the commodities where GST is concerned. And this was something we had to go to court for, that even during the pandemic, the GST on sanitizers was 18%. The GST on PPEs, which our doctors and our nurses were wearing, was 28%. The first thing which should have been done was to reduce. And I remember in the first few months of the pandemic, that's all we were doing, raising money for PPEs and for sanitizers and raising money for migrant workers and for their food. And we went to court, and luckily in Maharashtra, we won the case where this was concerned, that Indra Jaising fought the case for us on pro bono basis, and we got the 28% and the 18% removed, at least for a period of time where Maharashtra was concerned. But so, the revenue raising component is as important as the allocation component. And I think we see decentralized, of course, extremely important, what the states are doing. But I think under the cover of COVID and the camouflage of COVID, gender budgeting has really gone for a toss. They don't even give the statements. We don't have a gender budget statement at the center. And for many other states, unless there are some NGOs and organizations who are fighting for it. So I don't know to what extent this can really work. There's a lot to debate on the issue of, and I'm all for it. I'm not debating the issue of gender budgeting. It's very important. It's a huge right, but we also have to go a little beyond it to try and understand, and particularly in relation to livelihoods. Like I said, in MSMEs, there's nothing given. Handlooms taken away, forget about being given. Home-based workers taken away. Your Sumangali workers in Tamil Nadu are not recognized as workers anymore under the Code on Wages. Because what it says is that only if you're employed in an industry are you a worker. And the definition of industry now, not 10 workers, it has been increased to 20 workers. That again, there was a desperate demand that please don't increase the number of workers where no labor laws are to be applied. But that has also been rejected. And of course, this impacts, because we know the percentage of women in informal sector are much more than the percentage of women in the formal sector. I'm waiting for Asha to add on.
I was waiting for them to ask what they had to. No, it's a wonderful lecture, and 3 things that I think really emerged from your lecture was the unequal political economy that exists in this country. Also, the faulty social ecology. It's not only the political economy, it's also the
absolutely.
Ballots, and you spoke of the domestic workers, and the fault lines that are deepening as we go along. The fault lines that were already there are much, much deeper now. These, I think, were 3 things that I thought were very, very important that came out. And though COVID put labor at the center stage, as you mentioned, there was no data. And the magnitude of the people who moved showed in the media that there were large number of women moving. But in the kind of perceptions that were there by political scientists, by others, by the media, was that women were not migrants, that there were women who were moving. But if the woman died on the platform, and that became the icon of the migrant movement, it showed that there were the large number of women were there. But data was really depressing. Then the right of living wage, I think, is important, which you very, very strongly put it. But I remember that what happened during the migrant crisis was the weakness of the rural economy. As people came back from the urban places to the villages, they were not allowed into their homes. COVID was a stigma. They stayed outside. And then when they came in, there was nothing for them to do this, so they went back. So the rural economy is getting worse and worse instead of strengthening it. You can see that this is another major fault line that has been shown. But I wanted to know, Ritu, one thing that has always something that I have no idea about are the role of the trade unions. What did the trade unions do? Did they do anything or not? We heard so much of the brick kiln workers, in a desperate situation, the garment workers, women who could not even come back home, they were not allowed to come back home. And the new liberal economy with health, people died because of that. No one went to work. Hospitals were so very, very expensive. There were no PHCs, CHCs. Everyone was coming to the larger towns. So, these kind of things in the, what were the trade unions doing? The government, of course, was looking at charity as the new, play card of the migration that we are doing. We are giving you welfare, but no one talked about independence. So in that independence mode comes the role of trade unions. But I don't see much on that. Or is that also a weakening sector?
Well, trade unions have been impacted, I think, by the overall political scenario and the economic scenario, very much so, because the number of workers are declining. I mean, like I said, 20% workers decline even in the year before the pandemic. But at least in my experience, I've seen that there's no union which did not come forward. At least in Maharashtra and in several other states, their resources might be very limited. Okay, but many of them did come forward, but nobody can fill the vacuum of a irresponsible state. One tried at many different levels. Now, even if you see this entire issue of monetization, okay, the monetization pipeline, I think they're on an average of at least 8 strikes every day, right from station masters to loaders to nurses, you just name them. And there's no section which is not going on strike. Coal mine workers, every section, every day, there are minimum 8 strikes all over the country. Of course, not reported and not discussed at all, because these are non-issues. Okay, according to the current, whether it's media or state or whatever it may be, even state governments. I'm not absolving all the state governments of all the responsibilities which they have. I mean, in Maharashtra, in spite of the kind of support which the nurses gave, just 2 weeks ago, it was announced that the nurses will not be employed on a regular basis anymore. In fact, if anything, their conditions should be improved and their incomes should be improved. So it's not only as if states are not responsible, but unions did do quite a bit, okay, to whatever extent it was possible for them. Every section which I have seen, doctors, Anganwadi workers, coal miners, to whatever extent they could. In the Northeast, in Kashmir, Kashmir is an amazing example of how the migrants, earlier I'm talking about, during the migrant crisis, didn't want to go back, because they said the kind of respect that they get in Kashmir, they don't get anywhere else. And every employer, I traveled in Kashmir last year to try and understand all this, and I didn't meet a single migrant worker who said he was not taken care of by his employer. Okay, they were all given food in spite of no work, in spite of that insane lockdown which existed. So people did come out. But, for me, the defining thing is and some which really killed something in me at a point of time is when we are working with the migrant workers here. I don't know if I've said this, but it's something which I will never, ever, ever get over. And if we know, COVID in a way is a rich person's disease. All right. It came in a way for us in Bombay, in Mumbai. It came from the high rise. All right. And it came through a large number of workers, not even workers, but middle class, who were flown back in those, I don't know what planes they were called, Bharat planes or whatever they were called. Majority landed in Bombay and in Kerala. And I remember working with this migrant worker, and she was a Muslim woman, so you can, informal worker. And I was walking with them on the street, and this was near the airport, and the planes came. And this woman is telling me, she said, "Dekho, NRI वापस आ रहे हैं. The NRI are coming back." And the other Muslim woman replied, "We are also NRI." And I said, "Why? How are you calling yourself an NRI?" She said, "Non-required Indian." You know, this is, I think, just explains, I don't know which other statement explains what is happening these days. It's just shattered something, you know, very painful. Of course, there were many others. We know the changes which came under the camouflage of COVID, your Forest Rights Act dilution, the Panchayat Act dilution, the lack of focus on particularly those who were not only physically disabled, but the mental trauma which they went through. And as a, you know, I think the greatest indictment, apart from that statement which this migrant worker said to me, is that this budget, what it does, is that it says there's going to be a 35,000 crore capex, or 35% increase in capex, that is your capital expenditure. And everyone says, yes, yes, the basis of growth, etc. But you just break up, what is this capex being spent on? What is the capital expenditure being spent on? On airports, on railways, and on defense. These three together account for 64% of the capital expenditure of 22-23, and health 0.45%. And we know what the pandemic did. It exposed the need for the collapse of the public health system, the desperate need to develop a public health system rather than private health, which was, you know, people are still paying off loans for that. And also remember that defense, railways, and airports are being privatized and monetized. So our revenue, our money, capital expenditure, infrastructure expenditure on three sectors where the benefit is going to go totally to the private corporate sector. You know, so these are, I think, are very clear fundamentals. Who we are talking about, who really is a citizen or a privileged citizen of our nation, a very beloved nation.
So one more issue, Ritu, you discussed it in terms of the shadow pandemic, but
Yeah.
you know, violence was everywhere in different ways. It was
Yes.
underlying in everything that happened. But there was, I heard that now the NCRB is also thinking of withdrawing the data on gender violence. So, you know, these kind of changes that took place during COVID, no, there is no mention of violence taking place except that shadow violence that came up. But other violence, the militarization of society itself, and the withdrawing of, you know, all the Sakhi centers were closed.
Yes.
Protection officers were not there. There was no communication between the people and the protection system. All that became a very, very important part of COVID and the women who suffered during it.
Women and also men, I think, yeah.
The
And that's why I said, you know, this actualization of violence and the normalization of violence is something which it's not a psychological issue. It's a very strong issue of political economy, because your NCRB data are totally withdrawn. Migrant data does not exist at all. There was no portal for migrant workers registration. Again, some of us went to the Supreme Court, and it took 1 year for the government to set up this portal, which kept collapsing all the time. And don't forget, digitalization has actually increased inequalities.
Yeah.
You know, that is a huge issue which exists. So all your divides, your education data, which is coming out, even the new issues of, these startups and unicorns and all these insane terms, we don't mean anything at all to the majority of the country, are being touted as a form of development, or growth, sorry, not development. But it doesn't mean anything at all for, it's even taking away the MSME definitions in many kinds of ways in terms of benefits. So maybe in a year or two, we'll see how much MSMEs, whatever, 15% of the credit which they're getting. And of course, mainly women. So you have this typical phrase, I mean, what I say it all the time, microfinance for women and macro finance for corporate men. Okay, not for men in that sense of the term. So, yeah.
Ritu, I don't think anything has improved, the so-called ease of doing business. I don't think it actually exists, because technically now my consultancy is an MSME. I had to register it in order to be able to do bank work. And I'm trying to set up a current account because, well, that's a different story. But, among other things, so by definition, if it's a one-person place, it's a micro enterprise. I am required to give house documents.
Yeah.
Why would you assume that to run a micro enterprise, I need to own a home?
Exactly.
Can I not? I mean, is the person who runs the Istrika Tela outside not a micro entrepreneur? She owns the 2 carts, she owns the iron, she buys the coal, she employs people, and she runs a viable business. Well, no, maybe not lucrative, but viable. But anyway, that wasn't what I want. One of the things I think about when we think about gender budgeting is also the kinds of things that are considered gender appropriate programs or gender mainstreaming programs.
Yes.
I'm not an economist, but I look at political party manifestos erratically to see what they are saying. And the kinds in 2020, 21, 22, the kinds of allocations they're promising are still going to very patriarchal projects and premises. Giving a girl gold for her wedding, putting in money,
yes.
And where do you make the shift? Maybe the allocation will come, maybe it won't come. Let's even be optimistic and assume the allocation will come and we'll check off some gender budgeting box. But how do you change? I mean, we've got people to mainstream the idea of the ritual of gender budgeting, but how do you change that content, and when will that happen? When
will it happen is impossible. Something happened and that's also been taken away. So the issue of de-equalization and increase in patriarchal rigidities. And I don't see the situation getting any better. I'm sorry.
Not now, yes.
Yeah, but what one gave huge hope and one gets huge hope from is the farmers' movement. I think that is what I call a jwala. It was like an awakening for many of us who were in despair that, nothing is going to happen, etc., etc. And the burgeoning movements and demonstrations which are taking place. And of course, like I said, which are not talked about at all. And in terms of, when you talked about your registration, I mean, the data says, and that's day before's data, that 65% of the MSMEs, including the medium enterprises, could not access because they couldn't fill the forms and fill in the papers required. So even if you're a micro enterprise, you have to have wealth to be able to be even defined as a micro. So you have to have house to be able to, your own experience. So which goes against a very basic definition. It's also like this thing of skilling. I've been working, many of us have been working on skill and skill development and upgradation. And now with this issue of skill in India and make in India, etc., etc. You see the Skill India allocation is just about 4,000 crores in a time when your unemployment is into millions and millions and increasing dramatically every single day. And there's no concept of gender in that. Again, we had a huge, big panel, national level panel discussion with the head of the state, of the national skill companies, etc., and including government representatives. And all I could see is what I have been calling a PPP mode. Okay, it used to be, it's known as what a public-private partnership. But I just call it a papad, pickle, and petticoat syndrome. That's the model. That's all they want to skill women on.
Yes.
So it's continuation, and actually it's not a continuation. It's a withdrawal of at least some ideas which had come forward. And I think the attitude against women is going to get worse and worse and more. It's not only the mindset, it's your structural changes which have changed, the entire attitude. So your violence against a minority woman is justified, all right, and not even counted. And therefore, what Asha was saying, the NCRB data, of course, is withdrawn. But even the definition of a riot has changed. Please don't forget that. So it's claimed that there are only about 10 riots in 5 months. But the riot definition is now that so many people have to be injured. So many, your data is a big game. It's a big game. It's become, I shouldn't say it, a 4-letter word. So already today, I think last night, the Reserve Bank said now we need to develop alternative data sources.
Last question, Ritu. We have about 2 minutes. This is from Kamachi. Your comments on campaigning for mechanizing or institutionalizing the state government towards an annual process of pre-budget discussion with the marginalized women to evolve new schemes.
Oh, I'm all for
I'm
this.
giving you 2 minutes.
No, I know. I think I've gone beyond time. Or there is only 2 minutes left. No, one is all for this. I think we have to carry out that campaign. We've also been making representations, etc., etc. Now, whether the representations are accepted or not, but we also have to present alternatives. It's not enough to say that this is wrong and that is wrong. We have to say that this is right and this is what. So, in fact, we are very lucky in Tamil Nadu and in Maharashtra that we have people who listen to us, in whether it's in governments or whether it is in others, and I'm sure Orissa and several other states too. But we have to evolve alternate schemes. So we developed an alternate scheme for livelihood scheme for trans workers, for trans persons, and that got implemented. Not ideally, but at least it is a step forward. So I think these campaigns, and also we must come together on campaigns. We have so much to learn from each other. All of us producing the same similar kind of schemes at different levels. Regional specificities, of course, are important, but there are also conceptual clarities, I think, which are very essential. I hope that's something which we can take forward.
So on that note, thank you so much, Ritu. You are coming back again and again and again, of course. But so this is the end of one session with Professor Ritu Dewan, and there will be more in different formats and for different purposes. And we look forward to having all of you back. Thank you for coming today.
She doesn't tell me that. She asks you again and again and again.
Huh?
I said, how come I don't get asked again and again?
Because as Ritu said at the beginning of the program, you are part of the organization. I don't get to invite you. You just hear, that's all.
Yeah, you're there. You're taken for granted, Asha.
Yeah, that's a very good interpretation.
But it's true.
We need to meet now. It's time to meet sometime.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
All of us.
Yeah, really.
We
started physical meetings, huh? Our labor economics, feminist policy collective, we started. Jo nahi aaye, but we will certainly. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, Kamakshi. Keep in touch. Huh?
Ma'am, sure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Next month, I should say, I forgot the promo. Next month, we have Ruchira Goswami speaking about gender, law, violence, and I'll get you a formal title soon, but second Saturday, July, 10:30 to 12. So thank you.
Let me know also.
Yes, yes, for sure.
Okay, thank you.